the asset-backed sector of the bond market. We'll follow the sequence in the curriculum as we've been doing all along. I'll just give you first a few high-level points. In the curriculum, this is a fairly long reading, and I think it's impossible to understand, or it's impossible to learn every single detail. Even the summary of this reading is over 4-5 pages. Okay, so you can imagine the amount of detail involved here. But rather than getting hung up with all the details, what we really need to do is understand, I think, this section 2 securitization process and the overall features of the asset-backed securities. This is a critical segment. And then the subsequent sections are just on every kind of asset-backed security which is distinguished by the type of collateral. They have a section on every type. The learning objectives, 70% of the learning objectives are based on this section. And then you have 1 or 2 learning objectives that just lump together all these guys. So when you talk about home equity loans, or let's say auto loan backed securities, this is simply an asset backed security where the collateral is auto loans. For all these various kinds of asset backed securities, we just need to understand the core cash flow characteristics, prepayment characteristics, and obviously what exactly are they. Okay, so rather than going over all the details in the curriculum, I'll just focus on the core points that the learning objective statements highlight, but the sequence I'll go through is along with the curriculum. You keep seeing securitization in level 1, and we've seen it here in level 2. I think one of the best definitions of securitization is in the introduction to this reading. So let's go through that description. As an alternative to the issuance of a bond, a corporation can issue a security backed by loans or receivables. Debt instruments that have as their collateral loans or receivables are referred to as asset-backed securities. The transaction in which asset-backed securities are created is referred to as securitization. So effectively, all we are saying is that just like a company issues bonds to get money, this whole process of securitization is effectively a way of funding, or it's a way of getting money. Okay. Here is a good example from the curriculum on the whole securitization process. And actually, another larger point that I just want to make sure you get. When we talk about an asset-backed security, what do we mean? We mean any security that is backed by assets such as home loans, car loans, or what's the common feature of all asset-backed securities? It is that the collateral is cash paying. So if the definition of an asset-backed security is that the collateral basically generates cash, then would a mortgage-backed security be an asset-backed security? Mortgage-backed securities are asset-backed securities. Or let me put it this way, all mortgage-backed securities are asset-backed securities. Are all asset-backed securities mortgage-backed securities? No. So if I were to put this very briefly, your asset-backed securities, the biggest category of asset-backed securities is mortgage-backed securities. Why do we talk about these separately? Why do we have a separate reading for mortgage-backed securities? Because this is a huge market. And what's the distinguishing characteristic of mortgage-backed securities? That the backing or the collateral for these is loans against some form of real estate. Okay. Then there are all these other categories of asset-backed securities which we will discuss in this reading. Okay, so let's look at the example from the curriculum. You have a company called Quality Home Theatre Inc. This company makes high-end home entertainment products, and the products are sold for anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000. When the company sells its product, typically the sale is financed by the company itself. So if the sale is financed, that means that on the balance sheet of Quality Home Products, which we'll call QH or Quality Home Theatre Inc., QHT, on its balance sheet it will have several loans, consumer loans. Okay, so customers buy the product, and to buy the product they borrow money. So you have all these loans sitting on the balance sheet of QHT. Okay. Now, one thing that QHT can do is it can sell the loans to a special purpose vehicle, SPV. Let's say the SPV is called HAT. The loans could be sold to the SPV. All right. So now all these loans move from here to the balance sheet of the special purpose vehicle. These loans now, so the consumer loans, are used as collateral to issue securities. So these securities are the asset-backed securities. Backed by what asset? These consumer loans. And obviously when the investors invest in these securities, they are paying cash to HAT. Okay, so now HAT has a ton of cash, and that cash is then used to, so all this cash that is being collected is the money that is being used to issue new loans to customers. Okay. Now, as a side remark, why do companies do something like this? The reason is that when the SPV is raising money, or this is essentially it is funding, so it is raising money through asset-backed securities. As long as investors can see this collateral and no one other than them has access to this collateral, that will allow investors to invest here and be willing to get a relatively low return. The whole point here is, if investors see this shiny, good collateral that they can touch and feel and put their claim on, they are willing to get money or invest at a relatively lower cost. So this structure reduces the cost of funding. If QHT directly issued the securities, then what would the issue be? Investors would be concerned that any money coming in from those loans might be used for other operations of QHT, and they might not have claim, which means the risk to the investors would be relatively high, which means the return they would demand would be high, which means the cost of funding would be higher. So typically what is quoted as the major reason for creating this SPV and going through this route is it lowers cost of funding. Okay, let's also understand some basic terminology. In the context of asset-backed security or the securitization process, who is the seller? The seller is the entity which originates the loans and sells loans to the SPV. So in our example, who is the one who originates the loans to the consumer? So QHT is the seller. The issuer or the trust is the SPV that buys the loans from the seller and issues asset-backed securities. So in our example, this is HAT, and the servicer is the entity that services the loans. So servicing the loans means making sure that customers are paying up, okay, calling the customers who are not making their payments on time, and so on. In this example, who is the servicer? It's QHT. Could the servicer be a third-party entity other than QHT and HAT? It could be. Okay, so in any case, in our simple example, you need to understand what the seller means, what the issuer means, and what the servicer means. All right. Now, who was Hat? He was the Hat is the SPV. This is the entity that issues the asset-backed securities. Say Hat wants to issue bonds with a par value of 100 million. The simple transaction would be that they issue 100,000 certificates, each with a par value of 1,000. That means if I bought one certificate, I would get 1 over 100,000. So this fraction of the payments from any collateral fees. So all the payments that come in from the so any payments that come in from the customers, for one certificate I get 1 over 100,000 of all the payments that come in, less any fees and expenses that need to be paid. Okay, so this is one structure. Now what's the issue with this structure? What are the sorts of risks that we have? There is prepayment risk. But remember now that we are not just in the comfortable and relatively safe world of agency mortgage-backed securities. So actually the risk that should come to you first, are you generally, when you make a loan, are you generally more worried about prepayment risk or about just credit risk? Okay, so now what should come to your mind first is credit risk, because people who spend $80,000 on home equipment, home theaters and so on, one needs to worry about them making their repayments. If the homeowners don't make their repayments, will you, as the investor in the asset-backed security, will you suffer? Yeah, that will be a huge problem. So do you think there is a mechanism of dealing with that? Can we eliminate credit risk? Yeah, credit risk cannot be eliminated, but can it be redistributed? So we can again do tranching to redistribute credit risk. If I say that tranching is the same as creating different bond classes, would you agree or disagree with that statement? You should agree, because tranches and bond classes are just synonymous. Okay. So alternatively, the issuing entity, which is Hat, could issue multiple bond classes or tranches. It could issue a senior bond class called A with a given par value of 90, B with 7, C with 3. Now what we are doing here is something called credit tranching. What do you think this means? If there are some defaults, some of the homeowners don't, or some of the people who bought the equipment don't make payments, who do you think will take the hit first? Yeah, C will take the hit first. So if there are 3 million worth of defaults, then C loses, but B and A are protected. If there are 10 million worth of defaults, then C and B are both impacted and A is safe. Okay, so what have we done? We have done tranching to redistribute credit risk. How have we redistributed? By giving more risk to C and less risk to A. And what's the advantage of doing this? Yeah, so people who buy bond class C will obviously require a higher return. Investors who just want to play it completely safe and would not want to invest in anything where there is major risk, the advantage is by creating the structure, you have also allowed them to become investors in this issue. Okay, so this was credit tranching. Now that we've talked about credit tranching, is there still prepayment risk?
Yes.
Okay, so do you think we can now have another dimension of tranching that deals with prepayment risk? What we could do is take this tranche. Let's say that we are pretty confident that the maximum that the default will be is about 6 to 7%. Okay, so then the people who invest in bond class A, can they feel reasonably comfortable that they don't need to worry too much about credit risk? They can, because that credit risk has been shoved off to B and C. Now, if the people who have invested or investors who have this bond class A, now they worry about prepayment risk. So what we can then do is take the bond class A and further subdivide that into A1, A2, A3, A4. And what do you think is happening in this tranching? So here we are redistributing the prepayment risk. Okay, so the point here is that these people will now get their money back, hopefully, and we can say that any prepayments go first to whom? Yeah, so typically if we are worried about prepayment risk, typically the first prepayment will go here and then we go up. So the prepayment happens first over here. Have we completely eliminated credit risk for this bond class A? No, we've not completely. Yeah, up till so, but it is conceivable that while obviously A has much lower credit risk than B and C, but there is still some credit risk. So all I'm trying to work with you on here is, we've established that the prepayment risk is least for A1, but then the credit risk is more for A1, because any principal payments that are coming in will go first to A4 and they will go at the end to A1. So while we have said, okay, A1 is relatively safe from a prepayment risk, but that comes at the expense of credit risk. Okay, so there is no completely free lunch. You give up on some prepayment risk, but then you gain more credit risk. Okay, now as long as you get that core point, you are in good shape for the exam. Obviously, you can keep creating all sorts of complex structures and make life difficult, but key is to understand this basic point. I think also Schwezer makes this a little bit more complicated, but you know what you've just heard is fundamentally what you need. All right. Next, let's talk about section D in the curriculum, which is the general classification of collateral and transaction structure. So collateral can be either amortizing or non-amortizing. What do you think this means? Muhammad Ali. Daniel, what's amortizing versus non-amortizing collateral? Yeah, exactly. So amortizing collateral is what we have fundamentally mostly talked about so far. So in your residential loans, the collateral, the payments that come in consists of both interest and principal. The principal could be both scheduled and prepayments. What is non-amortizing collateral? So non-amortizing I'll give you a classic example in the context of what you'll be studying. Do you think credit card loans could be used as collateral? So when people take out credit card loans, generally the unfortunate people who do that are often tied up doing what? Making just interest payments. Okay, would those classify as, so would those be amortizing or non-amortizing loans? They are non-amortizing loans. So the large point here is at a high level, collateral can either be amortizing or non-amortizing. With non-amortizing collateral, and again the classic example being credit card loans, the concept of prepayment does not arise. Where does the concept of prepayment arise? It arises where there is a scheduled principal payment to be made, and if the homeowner or whoever has taken out the loan makes a payment above that scheduled amount, that's a prepayment. With a credit card loan, from a credit card company perspective, who is their best customer?
Who never pays.
Yeah, the best customer is one who doesn't make any principal payments, keeps making all the interest payments on time. Okay, so actually a credit card company would not want prepayments. Okay, there is no concept of prepayments because there are no scheduled principal payments. Okay, so it's a very slippery path to be on, but anyway, right now we just need to understand what it is. So the question is, if somebody who has taken out a credit card loan pays the principal, how do we deal with that? That we will come to shortly. So we have to deal with that situation because people like you and me, when we buy on a credit card, we pay the entire amount. Okay. When the collateral consists of non-amortizing assets, typically there is a lockout period, a period where principal repayments are reinvested in new assets. After the lockout period, principal repayments are distributed to the security holders. The way you think of this is as follows. Remember, you have a financial institution in the middle that is doing the securitization. Okay. The loans, the credit card loans are over here. So you can think of these are the people who have the credit cards, and these are the people who have taken out loans on their credit cards and they make their credit card payments. It's this cash that is coming in, and this is the cash that is being used to pay off the asset-backed securities which are based on credit card loans. Now, the question that just came up was, what if people make principal or the actual loan amount, if that is paid? There is a lockout period. Let's say the lockout period is 2 years. In that lockout period, any principal amounts that come in, those principal amounts are used to issue more loans, more credit card loans. Okay, so this protects the holders of the asset-backed security from prepayment risk, okay, specifically from contraction risk. So we don't just take all the principal payments that come in and flow those through to the holders of the credit card-based asset-backed securities. We simply use that money during a lockout period to issue more loans, okay. A structure where there is a lockout for principal repayment is called a revolving structure. So just remember that terminology. The question is the lockout in asset-backed securities the same as the lockout in commercial? The answer is not quite. In commercial, when we talked about a lockout period, that was in the context of people not being allowed to make prepayments, okay, at a loan level. So a person who had borrowed money was being told that, okay, for the next 3 years, don't make a prepayment. The lockout period in the context of asset-backed security is that people who have credit cards, they can never be told, okay, don't make your principal payments. But here the lockout means when people make this at the financial institution level, that money is simply being used to issue new loans to maybe other credit card consumers. Okay, good. I forgot that point. Amortizing collateral does not change over the life of the security, while non-amortizing collateral, the structure of collateral or loan pool changes over time. The way you can think of this is amortizing collateral. What is amortizing collateral? The classic example being home loans. Okay, when you have home loans, let's say your pool consists of 5 or 6 different home loans. Over the life of that security, it's those same home loans, those same 6 home loans that are part of your collateral. Okay, in the credit card world, things can keep changing because Tausif here and Tokir here are diligent. They just pay off their credit card loans. Okay, so then that's no longer collateral. But then the money that's been raised is now used to issue a credit card to Sharik and Abdullah and John and Jane. Okay, so now the underlying pool has changed. Okay, now let's do this question. Suppose that the structure of an asset-backed security structure is as follows. You have a senior bond class with 380 million. This is the subordinate bond class and so on. So let's see you try to solve this problem. It's an example from the curriculum. Are we worried about prepayment risk or credit risk here? Credit risk. What is the amount to each if the loss due to defaults over the life of the structure is 15 million? What's the loss to the senior bond class? What about to bond class 1? So none, so the entire loss is to bond class 2. What about 50 million? So if it's 50 million, then these guys lose everything and they lose 30. And if the losses are very high, then even the senior bond class can lose some money. So very simplistic example, but it illustrates with credit tranching, you can reduce. Actually, is it better to say you can reduce credit risk, or is it better to say you can redistribute? So the redistribute credit risk mostly to bond class 2. So do you remember just memorizing these concepts in level 1? Redistributing, how many people actually understood it back then? So a few people did, but at level 2 you really need to understand it much better. Okay, so in general, as we study our different kinds of asset-backed securities, we need to understand the collateral cash flow. So here are some basic points that we'll first understand. One factor that may affect prepayments is the prevailing level of interest rates relative to the interest rate on the loan. So what is our default or our base case? This is the case that we generally see, that when interest rates go up, then prepayments in general will slow, and when interest rates go down, then in general prepayments go up. But what we'll notice is that this trend is stronger with certain kinds of asset-backed securities and less important in other kinds of asset-backed securities. Since a default is a prepayment modeling for an asset-backed security backed by amortizing assets require a model for projecting the amount that will be recovered and when it will be recovered. Now, this is a strange sounding statement that confuses most people, so I'll explain this. So they say that the curriculum says that a default is a prepayment. Okay, how can a default be a prepayment? The way you can interpret or understand this is, remember, we are taking the perspective of what entity? Yeah, so if there is this financial institution that is doing the securitization, when we say security, whatever the underlying collateral might be, let's say that the underlying collateral is a home loan, which is the simplest thing to think of, and it's the biggest type of collateral. When homeowner sitting over here, when homeowner defaults, what happens? The financial institution takes over the house, sells the house, gets the cash, and uses that cash to pay off the investor. So in that sense, when these defaults happen, the default of the homeowner not paying the bank, that is the default that is being referred to here. The prepayment being that, okay, when this happens, the house is sold and the cash comes in, and then that cash flows through. So when there are defaults, actually prepayment goes up. But the problem is that the house might not be sold at an appropriate price. So you need to worry about what are the sorts of defaults that can happen, and if defaults happen, what is the sort of cash flow that will be generated. Fortunately for us, we don't need to get into the details of that analysis, but we still need to understand that this analysis happens. Cash flow analysis can be performed on a pool level or a loan level. So either we can do an analysis at each individual homeowner level, or we can collectively treat it like a pool. As you might imagine, if this pool has 1 million loans, then it makes more sense to aggregate our analysis and do it at a pool level. The expected final maturity of an asset-backed security is the maturity date based on expected prepayments at the time of pricing of a deal. The legal final maturity can be 2 or more years after the final maturity. All this is saying is that the maturity of an asset-backed security can be different from what is initially expected. The average life is commonly used as the measure for the length of time an asset-backed security will be outstanding. That's straightforward. With an asset-backed security due to prepayments, a bond that is expected to have a bullet maturity may have an actual maturity that differs from that specified in the prospectus and is therefore referred to as a soft bullet. These last points, just basic idea is that the amount of time that we expect an asset-backed security to last might be different from actual.